Hello again. I've spoken about photo books before, and I thought it was a subject that was worth revisiting. And before, I've spoken about the kind of things to think about, perhaps when you're shooting. So to make sure you've got the right kind of format, you've got the right resolution of image to come up well in a photo book, if that's what you're planning to do. So start with the end in mind from that perspective of taking your photographs with a view to having them in a book. So that might be because you're traveling, you might be on a project, you might be just doing a personal project locally. So whatever it is that you're doing and whatever you have in mind as a final project, that will obviously determine what sort of resolution you need to be shooting. So I wanted to go beyond that because I've spoken a little bit about that before. I wanted to talk more about what you do once you've gone away and taken lots of photographs. And it's very easy to sit down with thousands of photographs on a disk drive and have to start thinning those out so that you've got a number that you can put in a photo book. And obviously the size of the book is up to you. So how do you approach that? Now, obviously it depends a little bit on what you're doing. So it might be that you've gone on holiday somewhere. So that might in turn lead to a particular narrative or a particular sequence. So you might do either day by day or location by location. They would be fairly obvious ways to begin to order the book. But once you've got a broad order of how you want to present the photographs, that in turn will help you when it comes to choosing which particular images you're going to use. So I would say that's probably the first place to start. Just start thinking about what's the story. And I've spoken a lot about being a visual storyteller, as in when you're looking through your viewfinder or looking at the LCD on the back of the camera, what is the story? It can be quite a short story, but what's the story you are trying to tell with that photograph? And obviously, if you're doing that with every photograph, it makes sense that that would then extend into a group of photographs. What's the story of that group? Is it telling the story of that place on that day? Is it giving people insights into a particular animal? It might be giving them views of an animal that they wouldn't normally get, or a shot that makes them think about something differently. It might be something they see every day. So you could, for example, shoot in a location that you know well, but shoot detail. So what's running through my mind at the moment is when I was with We're Observers, the guys there, we would sometimes meet at Circular Quay, and they pointed out that in the railings, so this is in the railings where the ferry terminal is, so most people are just shooting past these railings to get onto their ferry, but there are these beautiful little dolphins. So whatever you're shooting and whatever your theme is, that in itself will hopefully give you some clues to how to order your book and how to have the content flow in some way that for somebody approaching it cold, they can get into it. Because if you've got a narrative, a visual narrative going, then you really want that narrative to draw people in so that they enjoy the photograph they're looking at and they want to look at the next one. So these are the kind of things to be thinking about. Now, it might not be immediately apparent, so I wouldn't worry about that if you're starting to put a book together and you really are struggling with how to order the book. I would perhaps suggest a couple of things, what I've already suggested. So it might be by date, it might be by subject, whether that's an animal or a location or something else. With the railings that I mentioned, it could be details. You could go macro to micro and kind of have a flow in that direction. So different ways of doing it. One tip I would give you, it was something that I used to do with portrait photographs, is if you're going to mix black and white and color images, I would suggest starting with the black and white and then moving to color, because it tends to make the color that much more impactful. Because if you've been looking at a sequence of black and white and then you switch to color, that color has a greater impact. You might do that as the whole book. So first part of the book is black and white, second part is color, or you might do it in sections. So you lead a section with black and white and then switch to color, then back to black and white for the next one. So these are just ideas, and they may or may not work for you, but these are just ways you can arrange the images that you shortlist. And that does bring us to the next thing. It's how do you shortlist thousands of images? So what I would suggest, first of all, is to have an idea, and it doesn't have to be too precise, but just a rough idea of how many images you want to have in the book and how you're going to show them. Because if you have one image per page, that's definitely one way of doing it. Or you might, on some pages, have, say, 4 smaller images just together on one page. Now, if you're going to have 4 smaller images, they could be a sequence of the same subject. So that would mean that you might have 4 or maybe even 5 photographs if you've got 4 small, 1 large. And that would be a nice 2-page spread in the book and give a nice sequence. Maybe it's showing a behavior, whatever else it might be. So it's something to think about, and to think about how big you want the book to be. Now, that might be driven by cost. It might be driven by the audience that you have. So there are various things that can drive how big you might want this particular photo book to be, but it's something to think about. So getting back to your thousands of images, how do you start to break them down? Well, a few things to look at when you're doing your initial culling. And the first thing I would say, that anything isn't really sharp, unless you particularly want out of focus images, but assuming that you don't, then make sure that they're the best, sharpest, clearest photographs that you've got. So make sure they're technically good. Even if you bring them out a little bit with post-processing, you pretty much want them nice and sharp so that they'll reproduce well. Bear in mind, you probably want to have them as 300 ppi, as points per inch, pixels per inch, and that will give you a bigger file, but it gives you more detail in the photograph. And most photo books I'm aware of would tend to look at 300 being a good number to go for, simply because if you go higher, there's not that much, you can't see that much difference. But if you go lower, you can have quite a fall off in the detail and the sharpness of the photograph. So bear that in mind. So first of all, make sure they're technically good. The next thing is, if you have particular photographs that are your favorites, try and include those. And the only thing that would stop me putting in a favorite would be if I just felt technically it wasn't good enough for the book. I might have got a focus wrong, I might have got a shutter speed wrong, and it's a little bit blurry, and I've not been able to correct it. So those also are things just to look at. And I think you have to be pretty ruthless sometimes. Sometimes there might be a photograph you really like, but if you're being honest, it isn't technically correct. And again, it depends on what you're doing with the book. If it's something that's just for you or just for a small group of friends, that might be okay. But if it's a book that you want to sell or you want to represent and showcase your work, you really have to make sure that the images you're choosing are the highest quality, because you want every image that somebody looks at to be as good as it can be. It needs to be technically correct, because people will judge you by your worst photograph. So something to think about. Okay, so what then? So hopefully in that process, that will begin to reduce the numbers. And what I often do, I have an initial kind of cull. So what I will do is scoot through all of the images on Bridge. Now, if you're using Lightroom, you have quite good indexing options in Lightroom, and that can make it much easier to find particular photographs. You could tag them by location, by the subject, if it's an animal, the type of animal, that kind of thing. I'll be honest, I don't do that because I don't use Lightroom. Not that there's anything wrong with Lightroom, it's just that I sort of gradually taught myself what I needed to know on Photoshop. And as much as I have dabbled a little bit with Lightroom, but usually I'm in a hurry to do things, and I tend to just default to what I know best. So I'll tend to look at things on Bridge. I will pull images off, normally the raw image, and just put it in a collection of images that are potentials. And then once I've gone through that process, and normally I'll still have a few hundred images quite often at that stage, I'll then look at images and look at which ones are very similar. If, for example, it's the same animal and it might be doing similar things, but I shot it on different days. So I've got some images from earlier in the shoot, whether it's a day or several weeks or whatever it is, and then other images later, and I might just compare those against one another and make a choice on whether or not it's worth keeping both of them in, or just use one, or however many I feel that I want to make up that particular sequence and to tell that particular story. So that then means I have a second pass, and that's where I'll sort of get rid of, they're not quite duplicates, but they're very similar. So pictures that are very similar, I will then cut out that way. Another way that I'll also approach this is to look at how I've decided to break the book up. It might be by, in my case with wildlife, it's often the type of animal. And I've done a couple of books that are just elephants. So with those, I'm obviously just using pictures of elephants, but I'm looking at behaviors. There's certain things I want to talk about. It might be diseases they have. It might be showing the conditions. So there will be wide shots in there. There'll be close-up shots. There'll be close-ups of the underneath of their feet to show how the underside of their feet are marked and how that marking transfers itself to sand if you're tracking animals, and how you tell if a particular track is recent or not so recent. So things like that. What do you want to do with the book? So mine, that particular one, was designed or intended to be nice pictures of elephants so that you can enjoy the pictures of elephants if you like them, but also to have an educational aspect and also talk a bit about the project, which is the HRA in Namibia, which is one of the projects that I'm supporting with my wildlife prints, with the print sales. So I put money from those sales back into those projects to help them along. So these are just things to think about. It can be purely a picture book with just pictures, or you might be diving in and telling little stories about your primary subject. And obviously I'm talking about wildlife, but if you were to visit a city, there might be certain aspects of that city that you learnt about while you were there, or you experienced when you were there, and that would maybe create a section or a chapter in the book that stands alone. So hopefully there are some ideas coming from that. And having these ideas as well, thinking about them before you go on a trip, is also helpful, because you can think about what photographs you want to take. And again, I've spoken before about where you can get inspiration for that. It might be by looking at Instagram. It might be by looking at websites about that place or that animal or whatever it is. And everything's visual these days. So there's lots of ideas. And you may even like a particular shot if it's a place. What I used to do when I was doing more travel photography, I would often, so this is really pre-internet days, I would go to tourist shops where they had postcards, and I would just flick through the postcards and look at the shots they had in the postcards, and then if I liked them, I might buy one or two, three, whatever it was, postcards, then go back to my hotel and work out where they'd taken the shot from, so that I could reproduce that shot if I wanted to, or think of a way of doing that shot but having my own little spin on it. So there's different ways you can approach the subject of shooting your subject, and how you can make use of other people's ideas. I mean, we're all sharing ideas. It might not be conscious, but we're all doing it. So that's another thing to just look at. So as you're reducing the potential candidates, if you like, for your book, these are the kind of things to be thinking about. And then probably the final thing is, once you've got your collection of or your sort of final pass of photographs, and in my case it depends on the book, but generally it's around 100, sometimes a bit less, sometimes a bit more, depends what I'm going for. And then I look at just how I'm going to present them in the book. And as I said, it might be a full page image. It might even be a double page spread. You could, do a full double page reproduction of the image. And for those, if you're going to use those, the lay flat books are good for that kind of image because you lose the spine effectively. So it just becomes a much wider shot. And the other way, of course, is to have several photographs on a page. So it might be 4, it might be 2, it might be 6, whatever it might be, whatever floats your boat. Then the other thing to think about is, do you want much text? I tend to, if I'm not particularly wanting to educate, I tend to reduce my text because I'd rather make it about the photograph. If your text is purely identifying the subject, let's say an animal, that might be the animal, where you shot it, maybe when you shot it, if you want to date stamp it. You can either have that on the page, or you could have just a section at the back where you just list the photographs, maybe page by page, and just have that information there. So you might want to make it purely a much more, I think of it as an art book, where the photograph stands alone as a piece of art. Words might be a distraction, particularly if it's one of those photographs where with an animal or even with a person, you've got really good eye contact. And with that kind of shot, you might even have one image maybe on one page and the facing page is blank, no text. So there's absolutely no distractions at all. So obviously there are different ways to approach the photo book. It might be a documentary book, so you might be just telling your story. It might almost be a visual diary. If you're traveling, you might choose to do it day by day and just start each section with the date and where you are maybe. You might be able to add maps to show physically where you are and maybe where you traveled that day, so that people know where that section of photographs were taken, and then you move on to the next section or chapter and you do the next day. If it might be by geographic location. So again, I've really covered most of this, but it's just things to think about. What would make the most sense to somebody who doesn't know the background story? I think that's the best way to approach it. If somebody doesn't particularly know you, they don't know what you were doing, why you were there, how can you use the photographs to pass that message back to them so that they can understand what you're doing, why you're there? So that, I think, pretty much covers it. As I've said, do make sure that you're perhaps starting with the end in mind. The usual things are to make sure you really know your camera when you're away, because that way you can focus on the art side of it, if you like, or the creative side of coming up with the final image that you want without having to either look things up on your camera or, even worse, take shots and then realize you completely messed them up and your focus is wrong, or your depth of field is wrong, or your lighting is wrong, whatever else. So as always, especially if you're going away on a trip where it's expensive or difficult to go back, I definitely recommend taking as many photographs as you can with your camera so that you are really familiar with how to use it and how to get the kind of results you're aiming for. So that might be walking around where you live, taking photographs. It might be photographing any wildlife you've got around. My go-to is always birds, because birds are pretty much everywhere and they can be quite tricky to shoot. So I think they're quite a good subject to practice on. And once you've started getting your bird shots to a stage where you're getting them where you want them, then you're in good shape for doing what you want to do when you're away. Okay, so I'm going to finish it there. It's a slightly shorter podcast than usual, but hopefully a useful one. And I will speak to you again next time. So bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.